Picture this: a landmass so vast it defies comprehension, floating in isolation for millions of years, like a forgotten ark in the southern seas. This is Australia, a continent that time forgot, where evolution took the most extraordinary detours imaginable. From the moment the first human footsteps touched its ancient shores over 65,000 years ago, this land has been writing one of the most remarkable stories in human history. But here's what most people don't realize about Australia. This isn't just the story of a country. This is the epic tale of an entire continent that became a crucible for some of the most incredible civilizations, the most brutal conflicts, and the most jaw-dropping survival stories our planet has ever witnessed. We're talking about a land where indigenous peoples created the world's oldest continuous culture, where European explorers met their doom in unforgiving deserts, and where convicts built what would become one of the world's most prosperous nations. The story I'm about to tell you spans over 65,000 years of human triumph, tragedy, innovation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. From the Dreamtime creation stories of the Aboriginal peoples to the modern, multicultural powerhouse we see today, Australia's history reads like the most unbelievable adventure novel ever written. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why this continent has produced some of the toughest, most resourceful people on Earth. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into the entire history of Australia, and I promise you, this story will blow your mind. Our tale begins not with Europeans, not with Captain Cook or the First Fleet, but in the mists of time, when the world looked completely different. Around 65,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. What we now call Australia was connected to New Guinea, forming a massive landmass called Sahul. But even then, this supercontinent was separated from Southeast Asia by treacherous stretches of ocean. This is where our story takes its first incredible turn. Somehow, impossibly, the first Australians made a journey that would challenge even modern explorers. They crossed at least 90 kilometers of open ocean in primitive boats, navigating by the stars, ocean currents, and sheer instinct. Think about that for a moment. While Europe was still locked in ice and most of humanity was struggling to survive in caves, these pioneering people were making one of the most daring maritime journeys in human history. These weren't just lucky survivors blown off course by a storm. Archaeological evidence shows this was a deliberate, planned migration. They brought fire, tools, and most importantly, the knowledge to survive in a completely alien environment. When they stepped onto the shores of northern Australia, they encountered a world unlike anywhere else on Earth. Picture a landscape populated by creatures that seem to have escaped from mythology. Giant wombats the size of cars roamed the plains. Massive flightless birds called genyornis, standing 2 meters tall, stalked through forests. Enormous monitor lizards, some reaching 7 meters in length, basked in the sun. There were marsupial lions with retractable claws like sabers, and diprotodon, massive herbivores that looked like hippo-sized wombats. This was the Australia that greeted the first human inhabitants. A land of giants, where survival required not just courage, but an entirely new way of thinking about the world. And survive they did. More than that, they thrived. Over the next several thousand years, these first Australians spread across the entire continent with breathtaking speed. By 45,000 years ago, they had reached the southern coast of what is now Victoria. By 40,000 years ago, they were living in Tasmania, which was then connected to the mainland by a land bridge. This expansion represents one of the most successful colonization efforts in human history. But this wasn't just a story of migration. It was a story of adaptation that borders on the miraculous. As these people spread across Australia, they encountered every possible environment our planet can offer. Tropical rainforests in the north, arid deserts in the center, temperate forests in the south, and alpine regions in the southeast. Each environment demanded different strategies, different tools, different ways of life. In the tropical north, they developed sophisticated fishing techniques, creating elaborate fish traps and learning to navigate complex river systems. In the deserts, they mastered the art of finding water in seemingly barren landscapes, reading the subtle signs that revealed underground springs and seasonal water sources. In the forests, they became expert hunters and gatherers, developing an intimate knowledge of plant cycles and animal behavior. What's truly remarkable is how they achieved this adaptation. Rather than trying to change the environment to suit their needs, as later Europeans would attempt, these first Australians learned to work with the land. They developed what we now recognize as the world's most sophisticated system of environmental management. The secret weapon in their arsenal was fire. Not the destructive, uncontrolled fire that we often associate with bushfires today, but carefully planned, precisely executed controlled burns that transformed the entire continent. This wasn't random burning. This was landscape engineering on a continental scale. These controlled burns, known as fire stick farming, served multiple purposes. They cleared undergrowth, preventing the massive bushfires that could devastate entire regions. They encouraged the growth of certain plants while suppressing others, essentially creating managed grasslands that attracted game animals. They regenerated soil nutrients and promoted the growth of fire-adapted plants that produced food. The results were extraordinary. Archaeological evidence suggests that this fire management created a mosaic of different environments across the continent, each carefully maintained to maximize resources. What European explorers would later describe as wilderness was actually one of the most intensively managed landscapes on Earth. This fire management had another profound effect. It contributed to the extinction of Australia's megafauna, those giant creatures that had dominated the continent for millions of years. The relationship between human arrival and megafauna extinction is complex and still debated by scientists. But it's clear that the combination of climate change, habitat modification through burning, and direct hunting pressure led to the disappearance of most large animals within a few thousand years of human arrival. By 30,000 years ago, Australia had been transformed. The giant marsupials were gone, replaced by the smaller kangaroos, wallabies, and other animals we recognize today. The landscape had been reshaped by thousands of years of careful fire management. And across this transformed continent, hundreds of distinct Aboriginal groups had developed their own languages, customs, and territories. Each group adapted to their specific environment in remarkable ways. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land developed complex seasonal calendars based on the behavior of animals and the flowering of plants. The Pintupi people of the Western Desert created songlines that served as both spiritual beliefs and practical navigation systems across vast stretches of seemingly featureless terrain. The Gunditjmara people of Western Victoria constructed elaborate aquaculture systems, building channels and weirs to farm eels on an industrial scale. These weren't simple hunter-gatherer societies scraping by at subsistence level. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex social structures, advanced technologies, and rich cultural traditions. They developed the boomerang, possibly the world's first aerodynamically designed tool. They created art that rivals anything produced by their contemporaries in Europe or Asia. They established trade networks that spanned thousands of kilometers, exchanging goods, ideas, and genetic material across the continent. The social organization of these societies was equally impressive. Most groups were organized into complex kinship systems that determined everything from marriage partners to ceremonial responsibilities. These systems were so sophisticated that anthropologists are still working to fully understand them. They created laws and customs that governed resource use, territorial boundaries, and social behavior with a precision that would impress modern legislators. Perhaps most remarkably, they developed what may be the world's oldest continuous religious and cultural tradition. The Dreamtime, or dreaming as it's sometimes called, isn't just a collection of myths and stories. It's a comprehensive worldview that explains the creation of the landscape, the relationships between all living things, and the proper way to live in harmony with the environment. According to Dreamtime beliefs, ancestral spirits traveled across the land during the creation period, forming mountains, rivers, and other landscape features as they went. These spirits left behind not just the physical features of the land, but also the laws and customs that should govern human behavior. Every rock formation, every waterhole, every significant landmark has its place in this spiritual geography. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. Dreamtime stories served as practical maps, environmental guides, and legal codes all rolled into one. A single story might contain information about seasonal water sources, the behavior of game animals, proper marriage customs, and territorial boundaries. This oral tradition was so effective that it preserved detailed environmental knowledge for tens of thousands of years without any written records. The sophistication of Aboriginal culture extended to their artistic traditions as well. Rock art sites across Australia contain some of the world's oldest known artworks, with some dating back over 40,000 years. These aren't just random doodles on cave walls. They're complex symbolic systems that record everything from hunting techniques to spiritual beliefs to historical events. The X-ray style paintings of Arnhem Land show the internal organs of animals with anatomical accuracy that rivals modern scientific illustrations. The Bradshaw paintings of the Kimberley region depict human figures with such dynamic movement and artistic sophistication that early European archaeologists couldn't believe they were created by Aboriginal artists. The petroglyphs of the Pilbara contain thousands of images that may represent the world's oldest known maps, but perhaps the most impressive aspect of Aboriginal civilization was its sustainability. For over 60,000 years, these societies lived on the Australian continent without causing any major environmental collapse. They developed technologies and social systems that allowed them to thrive while maintaining the health of the ecosystems they depended on. This sustainability wasn't achieved through primitive simplicity. It required sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships, careful resource management, and social institutions that could enforce environmental protection across vast areas and long time periods. The fact that they maintained this balance for so long, while supporting have reached their peak, represents populations that made several one of the greatest achievements 100,000 people at in human environmental management. As we approach the end of this first chapter in Australia's story, we find a continent that had been thoroughly humanized. Every corner of the landmass, from the tropical north to the temp to the arid interior Eritrea south, from the fertile east coast, supported thriving Aboriginal communities. These weren't isolated tribes eking out a marginal existence. They were interconnected societies with complex trade relationships, shared cultural traditions, and sophisticated technologies. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Australian history. But the Aboriginal peoples had no way of knowing that their world was about to change forever. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, other human societies were developing technologies that would eventually bring them to Australia's shores. When that meeting finally occurred, it would reshape not just Australia, but the entire course of human history. The collision between these two worlds, when it finally came, would be one of the most dramatic and tragic encounters in the human story. But that's a tale for our next chapter, when we explore how European exploration would transform this ancient land and its peoples forever. The year was 1606, and the world was becoming smaller. European nations were locked in a frenzied race to map the unknown corners of the globe, driven by an insatiable hunger for gold, spices, and new territories to claim. The Spanish had carved up South America. The Portuguese dominated the African coast, and the Dutch were building a maritime empire that stretched from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. But there were still blank spaces on the maps. Vast stretches of ocean where cartographers could only guess what lay beyond the horizon. And in the minds of European explorers, one mystery loomed larger than all others: the Great Southland. For centuries, geographers had theorized about this mythical continent. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. According to their calculations, it had to exist. The northern hemisphere was heavy with landmasses, they reasoned, so there must be an equally massive continent in the south to balance the world. Without it, surely the planet would tip over and tumble through space like a lopsided spinning top. This wasn't just academic curiosity. European powers were convinced that whoever found this southern continent first would discover riches beyond imagination. They envisioned cities of gold, spice gardens that would make them wealthy beyond measure, and millions of souls ready to be converted to Christianity. The race was on to find this prize, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The Dutch were the first to get lucky. Willem Janszoon, commanding the ship Duifken, was exploring the waters around New Guinea when strong currents and unpredictable winds pushed him south. On a fateful day in 1606, he spotted an unfamiliar coastline stretching endlessly to the east and west. He had no idea he was looking at the northern edge of Australia. Janszoon and his crew made landfall on what is now the Cape York Peninsula. They spent several weeks exploring the coast, mapping what they could and searching for anything of value. What they found was not the golden cities they had dreamed of, but swampland, crocodiles, and hostile encounters with local Aboriginal groups. After several of his men were killed in skirmishes, Janszoon decided this barren coast held nothing worth the risk. He sailed away, dismissing what he had found as merely an extension of New Guinea. But word of his discovery spread through the Dutch maritime network like wildfire. Other explorers followed, each hoping to find the real treasures that Janszoon had surely missed. Dirk Hartog arrived in 1616, landing on an island off the western coast that now bears his name. He left behind a pewter plate nailed to a post, inscribed with details of his visit. It was the first European artifact left on Australian soil, a tiny marker of the massive changes that were about to unfold. Over the next few decades, more Dutch ships encountered the Australian coast, usually by accident. Ship after ship, blown off course while sailing to the Dutch East Indies, stumbled upon this mysterious landmass. They mapped stretches of the western and southern coasts, but each expedition came to the same conclusion. This was a harsh, barren land inhabited by primitive people and devoid of the riches that made exploration worthwhile. The Dutch called it New Holland, but they showed little interest in actually colonizing it. Why would they? Their trading posts in Indonesia were generating enormous profits with minimal investment. This southern land seemed to offer nothing but hardship and danger. They filed their charts away and focused their energies elsewhere. But the mystery of the Great Southland wouldn't die. In 1642, the Dutch East India Company decided to mount one final, comprehensive expedition to map this southern continent and determine once and for all whether it held any value. They chose Abel Tasman, one of their most experienced navigators, to lead what would become one of the most important voyages in Australian history. Tasman's instructions were ambitious. Sail south from Java, map the unknown southern lands, find the best harbours and trading opportunities, and determine whether New Holland was connected to other land masses. What he accomplished exceeded even these grand expectations. Sailing south and then east, Tasman became the first European to sight what is now Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land after the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. He planted the Dutch flag and claimed the territory, though he never actually encountered any of the indigenous inhabitants. The island seemed promising, with dense forests and clear signs of human habitation, but Tasman was under orders to keep moving. Continuing east, Tasman made an even more significant discovery. He became the first European to sight New Zealand, which he initially thought might be part of the Great Southland. After a brief and violent encounter with Maori warriors who killed several of his crew members, Tasman decided not to attempt a landing. He mapped the western coast of both islands and continued his voyage. But here's where Tasman's story takes a fascinating turn. As he sailed north and then west, he completely missed the eastern coast of Australia. He passed between Australia and New Zealand without realizing that entire continent. His charts, he had circumnavigated and showed New Holland as a massive island with an unknown eastern boundary, still leaving room for the possibility that it might be connected to an even larger southern continent. When Tasman returned to Java in 1643, his expedition was considered a failure by Dutch standards. He had discovered new lands, yes, but he had found no gold, no spices, no obvious opportunities for profitable trade. The Dutch East India Company filed his reports away and largely forgot about the southern lands for the next century. This Dutch neglect created an opening that would change everything. As the 18th century dawned, a new European power was rising to challenge Dutch dominance of the seas. Great Britain, fresh from victories over the Spanish Armada and growing stronger by the decade, was looking for new opportunities to expand its empire. British explorers and natural philosophers were particularly intrigued by the mystery of the southern lands. The man who would finally solve this mystery was James Cook, a Yorkshire-born sailor who had worked his way up from humble beginnings to become one of the Royal Navy's most skilled navigators. Cook's background was perfect for the challenges ahead. He wasn't born into privilege like many naval officers, but had learned his seamanship the hard way, working on coal ships in the harsh North Sea. He understood how to keep a ship running in difficult conditions, how to maintain crew morale during long voyages, and most importantly, how to make accurate maps of unknown coastlines. Cook's first voyage to the Pacific had an official scientific mission: to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, an astronomical event that would help scientists calculate the distance between Earth and the Sun. But Cook carried sealed orders that revealed the voyage's true purpose. After completing the Venus observations, he was to sail south and search for the Great Southland. In April 1770, Cook achieved what had eluded Europeans for over 160 years. He sighted the southeastern coast of Australia near what is now Gippsland in Victoria. Unlike the Dutch explorers who had encountered only the harsh western and northern coasts, Cook was seeing Australia at its most inviting. Green hills rolled down to sandy beaches, forests stretched as far as the eye could see, and smoke from Aboriginal fires indicated that this land was inhabited. Cook followed the coast north for over 2,000 kilometres, methodically mapping every bay, headland, and river mouth. His charts were masterpieces of accuracy, so precise that they were still being used by mariners well into the 20th century. He named geographic features as he went: Point Hicks, Ramhead, Cape Howe, Botany Bay, Port Jackson, Cape Byron. Each name reflected either the appearance of the landscape or honoured someone important to the expedition. The interactions between Cook's crew and the Aboriginal peoples they encountered were complex and often tense. At Botany Bay, the crew spent several days trying to establish friendly contact with the local Eora people, but the Aboriginal groups showed little interest in European trade goods and seemed more concerned with encouraging the strangers to leave their territory. This wasn't the reaction Cook expected. In Tahiti and New Zealand, Indigenous peoples had been eager to trade and had shown great curiosity about European technology. The Aboriginal response puzzled Cook and his men, though modern historians understand it better. The Aboriginal peoples Cook encountered were part of sophisticated societies with their own trade networks and technologies. They had no need for European goods and correctly assessed that these strange visitors represented a potential threat to their way of life. The most dramatic moment of Cook's voyage came at what he named the Endeavour River, near present-day Cooktown in Queensland. His ship struck the Great Barrier Reef in the dark of night, tearing a massive hole in the hull. For 23 hours, the crew worked desperately to save their ship, throwing cannons and supplies overboard to lighten the load while frantically pumping out rising water. They managed to beach the Endeavour and spent 7 weeks repairing the damage. During this time, Cook's crew had extended contact with local Aboriginal people, and the ship's naturalists, Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, made detailed studies of Australian plants and animals. Many species they collected were completely unknown to European science. Banks was so excited by these discoveries that he initially wanted to call the continent New Holland Botany Bay, after the incredible diversity of plant life they encountered. When the Endeavour was finally repaired, Cook continued north until he reached the tip of Cape York Peninsula. On a small island he called Possession Island, Cook performed a ceremony that would have enormous consequences for Australia's future. He raised the British flag and formally claimed the entire eastern coast of New Holland for King George III, despite having no authority to do so and ignoring the obvious fact that the land was already inhabited by hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal people. Cook's claim was based on the legal doctrine of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land. According to European legal thinking of the time, land that wasn't being used for agriculture or organised into recognisable states was considered empty and available for claiming. The fact that Aboriginal peoples had sophisticated systems of land management, complex territorial boundaries, and had been living sustainably on the continent for tens of thousands of years was irrelevant under European law. When Cook returned to England in 1771, his discoveries created a sensation. Here was the great Southland that geographers had theorised about for centuries. But it was even larger and more significant than anyone had imagined. Cook's charts showed that New Holland was indeed a continent, roughly the same size as Europe, with thousands of kilometres of coastline and vast unexplored interior regions. The British government faced a decision that would shape the next 2 centuries of Australian history. What should they do with this enormous new territory? Some officials suggested simply ignoring it, as the Dutch had done. Others proposed establishing trading posts along the coast. But a small group of influential figures had a radically different idea, one that would transform Australia from an Aboriginal homeland into a British colony through one of the most ambitious and controversial social experiments in human history. The plan they developed was born from crisis. Britain's American colonies were in revolt, and the traditional destination for British convicts was no longer available. British prisons were overflowing, and social reformers were demanding new approaches to criminal justice. What if they could solve both problems at once? What if they could establish a colony in this new southern land, using convicts as the founding population? The idea seemed insane to most rational observers. Take Britain's most dangerous criminals, load them onto ships, sail them halfway around the world to an unknown continent, and somehow expect them to build a functioning society. It was either brilliant or completely mad. And even the planners weren't entirely sure which. But desperation breeds innovation, and Britain was desperate. The American Revolution had slammed shut the traditional dumping ground for convicts, leaving British prisons bursting at the seams. Hulks, decommissioned warships moored in rivers and harbours, were crammed with prisoners, living in conditions that horrified even hardened officials. Something had to be done, and the southern continent Cook had mapped suddenly looked like a solution. The man who would turn this wild idea into reality was Lord Sydney, Britain's Home Secretary. Sydney was a pragmatist who understood that the convict problem required radical solutions. In 1786, he convinced King George III and Parliament to approve the most ambitious colonisation scheme in British history. They would establish a penal colony on the far side of the world, using the dregs of British society as its founding population. The logistics were staggering. They needed ships capable of sailing 15,000 nautical miles through some of the world's most dangerous waters. They needed supplies to sustain over 1,000 people for years in a land where nothing was known about soil quality, climate, or available resources. They needed guards to control the convicts, officials to run the colony, and enough skilled workers to build a functioning settlement from scratch. Most challenging of all, they needed to convince competent people to lead this expedition into the unknown. The wrong leader could doom the entire enterprise, leaving hundreds of people to die on the other side of the world, while Britain faced international humiliation and massive financial loss. The man they chose was Captain Arthur Phillip, a naval officer whose background seemed tailor-made for this impossible task. Phillip had served in the Royal Navy for decades, fighting in wars across Europe and America. He understood logistics, leadership, and most importantly, how to maintain discipline and morale in desperate circumstances. He was also unusually progressive for his time, believing that even convicts deserved fair treatment and the chance to reform their lives. Philip's instructions from the British government were both specific and impossibly vague. He was to establish a settlement somewhere on the eastern coast of New Holland, create a self-sustaining colony that would no longer require supplies from Britain, maintain order among the convict population, and somehow transform criminals into productive citizens. Oh, and he was to do all this while treating the Aboriginal inhabitants fairly and attempting to establish friendly relations with them. The preparation took over a year. Philip assembled what became known as the First Fleet, 11 ships carrying 1,187 people, including 778 convicts, 250 Marines and officers, and various officials, surgeons, and clergy. The convict population was a cross-section of Georgian Britain's criminal underworld. Pickpockets from London's slums, highway robbers from rural counties, political prisoners from Ireland, and women convicted of crimes ranging from theft to prostitution. But these weren't the hardened murderers that popular imagination might suggest. Most convicts were guilty of relatively minor property crimes, sentenced to transportation because British law imposed harsh punishments for even petty theft. A man could be transported for 7 years for stealing a loaf of bread. A woman might face the same sentence for lifting a handkerchief from a market stall. The ships were loaded with everything the planners thought a new colony might need: tools, weapons, building materials, seeds, livestock, medical supplies, and enough food to last 2 years. They brought cattle, pigs, sheep, horses, chickens, and even cats to control the rats that infested every sailing ship of the era. They packed prefabricated buildings that could be quickly assembled upon arrival, along with forges, mills, and workshops needed to establish basic industries. On May 13th, 1787, the First Fleet departed Portsmouth, beginning a journey that would take 8 months and cover half the globe. The voyage itself was an epic of endurance and survival. Ships of the 18th century were cramped, unsanitary, and dangerous under the best circumstances. With over 1,000 people crammed into spaces designed for much smaller crews, conditions were appalling. Convicts were chained below decks for most of the voyage, breathing foul air and living in spaces so cramped they could barely lie down. Disease spread rapidly through the fleet. Dysentery, scurvy, typhoid, and pneumonia claimed dozens of lives before they even reached their destination. Women convicts faced additional horrors, as sexual assault by guards and crew members was common and rarely punished. Yet somehow, Captain Phillip held the expedition together. He enforced strict discipline among his officers, ensured that convicts received adequate food and medical care, and maintained morale through the darkest moments of the voyage. His leadership during those 8 months may have saved the entire colonial enterprise from disaster before it even began. The fleet made stops along the way to take on fresh water and supplies: Tenerife in the Canary Islands, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and Cape Town in South Africa. Each stop provided brief relief from the cramped conditions aboard ship, but also reminded everyone how far they were travelling from everything familiar. By the time they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, they were sailing into waters that few Europeans had ever navigated. On January 18, 1788, the first fleet finally sighted the coast of New Holland. After 8 months at sea, the sight of land brought tears to the eyes of hardened criminals and experienced sailors alike. But their relief was premature. The first landing at Botany Bay, the location Cook had recommended, proved to be a disaster. What Cook had described as a promising site for settlement turned out to be a nightmare of swamps, poor soil, and inadequate fresh water. The Aboriginal people of Fora made it clear that these in the area, the ited guests were not welcome. Armed warriors appeared on the beaches, shouting and making threatening gestures while the Europeans tried to establish their first camp. Philip quickly realised that Botany Bay would never support a permanent settlement. After just 6 days of frustration and mounting tension, he made a decision that would change Australian history. He ordered the fleet to sail north to Port Jackson, a harbour Cook had noted but never explored. What they found there took their breath away. Port Jackson was one of the finest natural harbours in the world, with deep water, numerous protected coves, and fresh water streams flowing into the sea. The Aboriginal people here seemed less immediately hostile, though they watched the newcomers with obvious concern. Most importantly, the land around the harbour appeared suitable for building the settlement they desperately needed. On January 26, 1788, Captain Phillip stepped ashore at what he named Sydney Cove and formally proclaimed the establishment of the colony of New South Wales. The date would later become Australia Day, though its significance would be viewed very differently by Aboriginal Australians, for whom it marked the beginning of a catastrophic disruption to their ancient way of life. The first months of the Sydney settlement were a struggle for survival that tested everyone involved. The convicts, many of whom had never worked with their hands, had to be taught to clear land, build shelters, and plant crops. The soil around Sydney Cove proved difficult to cultivate, and early attempts at farming failed miserably. Supplies brought from England began to run low, and the spectre of starvation haunted the colony. Relations with the local Aboriginal people were complex and often tense. The Eora people, led by figures like Pemulwuy and Bennelong, watched with growing alarm as these strangers began permanently altering their traditional lands. Some Aboriginal people showed curiosity about European technology and customs, while others made it clear through spears and fire that the invaders were not welcome. Philip tried to maintain his government's instructions to treat Aboriginal people fairly, but cultural misunderstandings and competing claims to land made conflict almost inevitable. Europeans saw unoccupied land as available for use, while Aboriginal people understood that every piece of landscape had spiritual significance and traditional owners. The clash between these worldviews would define much of Australia's subsequent history. The convict population presented its own challenges. Many had been transported for good reason, and the temptation to escape or rebel was constant. Philip established strict discipline, using flogging and other harsh punishments to maintain order, but he also offered hope. Convicts who worked hard and behaved well could earn their freedom and even land grants. This combination of punishment and reward gradually began to create something resembling a functioning society. Slowly, painfully, the settlement began to take shape. Crude huts gave way to more substantial buildings. Gardens started producing vegetables that supplemented the dwindling supplies from England. A few convicts revealed unexpected skills as carpenters, blacksmiths, or farmers, becoming valuable members of the community despite their criminal backgrounds. But the colony's survival remained precarious. In 1790, supplies ran so low that Philip was forced to cut rations to starvation levels. Everyone, from the governor to the lowest convict, survived on the same meagre portions of salt pork and flour. Some colonists began to talk openly of abandoning the settlement and trying to sail back to England, though such a journey with their limited resources would have been suicidal. Just when hope seemed lost, a ship appeared on the horizon. The Second Fleet, carrying fresh supplies and more convicts, arrived in 1790 to find a settlement on the brink of collapse, but still clinging to life. The relief was overwhelming, but the new arrivals brought their own problems. Disease, more mouths to feed, and reports that conditions aboard the Second Fleet had been even worse than those of the First Fleet. The colony's early years established patterns that would shape Australian society for generations. The division between free settlers and convicts created a complex social hierarchy. The tension between European and Aboriginal claims to land would fuel conflicts for the next century. The struggle to survive in an unfamiliar environment would forge a distinctive Australian character marked by resourcefulness, skepticism of authority, and fierce loyalty to mates. Perhaps most importantly, these early years proved that the seemingly impossible could be achieved through sheer determination and mutual dependence. Convicts, Marines, officials, and even some Aboriginal people found ways to cooperate when survival depended on it. The settlement that had seemed doomed to fail was gradually becoming something unprecedented. A functioning society built by people who had been cast out by the civilization that sent them. As the 18th century drew to a close, the tiny settlement at Sydney Cove had grown into a town of several thousand people. More ships arrived regularly, bringing new convicts, free settlers, and supplies. Other settlements were established along the coast and inland, extending British control over vast areas of the continent. The age of exploration was giving way to the age of colonisation, and Australia would never be the same. The transformation of Australia from a struggling penal colony to something resembling a functioning society didn't happen overnight. It took decades of backbreaking labour, devastating setbacks, and remarkable human resilience to create the foundations of what would become modern Australia. But by the early 1800s, something extraordinary was happening in this remote corner of the British Empire. The convict system that had begun as a desperate solution to Britain's prison crisis was evolving into something far more complex and significant. Many of the transported criminals were discovering skills they never knew they possessed. A pickpocket from London's East End might become a master carpenter. A highway robber from Yorkshire could prove to be a gifted farmer. Women convicted of petty theft were establishing businesses, running boarding houses, and becoming pillars of their communities. This wasn't the rehabilitation that British reformers had theorised about in their comfortable London drawing rooms. This was survival-driven transformation on an epic scale. When your life depends on building shelter, growing food, and creating the basic infrastructure of civilization from scratch, you either adapt or you die. Most chose to adapt, and in doing so, they were creating something entirely new in human history. The ticket of leave system became the backbone of this transformation. Convicts who demonstrated good behaviour and valuable skills could earn conditional freedom before their sentences expired. They couldn't leave the colony, but they could work for wages, establish businesses, and build lives for themselves. Many of these emancipated convicts, or emancipists as they became known, proved to be more successful than the free settlers who had voluntarily emigrated to Australia. This created a social dynamic unlike anywhere else in the British Empire. In England, your birth determined your place in society with rigid certainty. In Australia, your criminal record might actually be less important than your ability to survive and prosper in harsh conditions. Former convicts were becoming wealthy landowners, successful merchants, and respected community leaders. The traditional British class system was being turned upside down, but not everyone was happy with this social revolution. Free settlers, particularly those who arrived with money and connections, were horrified to find themselves living alongside former criminals who might be wealthier and more successful than they were. They lobbied for laws that would maintain the social distinctions they considered proper, fighting to exclude emancipists from juries, political positions, and social clubs. These tensions came to a head in what became known as the emancipist versus exclusive conflict. The exclusives, led by figures like John MacArthur, believed that former convicts should remain permanently marked by their criminal past. The emancipists, supported by governors like Lachlan Macquarie, argued that Australia should be a land of second chances, where a person's achievements mattered more than their origins. Governor Macquarie, who ruled New South Wales from 1810 to 1821, became the champion of the emancipist cause. He appointed former convicts to government positions, invited them to his official dinners, and publicly declared that a man's past should not determine his future in Australia. His policies scandalised the exclusives, but created opportunities for rehabilitation and social mobility that were unimaginable in the rigid hierarchies of Georgian Britain. Under Macquarie's leadership, the colony experienced unprecedented growth and development. He commissioned ambitious public works projects that transformed Sydney from a rough convict settlement into something resembling a proper city. The Hyde Park Barracks housed newly arrived convicts in conditions that were Spartan but humane. The Rum Hospital provided medical care for the growing population. Roads, bridges, and public buildings began to give the colony the infrastructure of a permanent society rather than a temporary penal experiment. But Macquarie's most significant achievement was his recognition of Aboriginal people as the original inhabitants of Australia. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who viewed Aboriginal Australians as obstacles to be removed or primitives to be civilised, Macquarie attempted to establish formal relationships with Aboriginal leaders and provide education and opportunities for Aboriginal children. His efforts in this regard were limited by the prejudices of his time and the growing pressure from settlers who wanted Aboriginal lands cleared for agriculture and grazing. But Macquarie's attempt to find some middle ground between European colonisation and Aboriginal rights represented one of the few bright spots in what was becoming an increasingly tragic confrontation between two completely different ways of life. The expansion of European settlement beyond the original coastal enclaves was accelerating dramatically by the 1810s. Settlers were pushing inland in search of grazing land for the sheep and cattle that were becoming the backbone of the colonial economy. The discovery that Australian wool was of exceptionally high quality created the first export industry that could make the colony financially viable. John MacArthur, despite his role as leader of the exclusives, deserves credit for recognising the potential of Australian wool. His experiments with Spanish merino sheep proved that Australia's climate and grasslands could produce wool that rivaled the finest European varieties. By 1820, wool exports were generating enough revenue to make New South Wales something more than a drain on the British Treasury. This economic transformation brought both opportunity and conflict. Successful wool growers became enormously wealthy, creating Australia's first genuine upper class. But sheep farming required vast amounts of land, and that land was already occupied by Aboriginal peoples who had managed it sustainably for tens of thousands of years. The resulting conflicts were brutal and largely one-sided. Aboriginal warriors, armed with spears and clubs, faced European settlers with muskets, horses, and the backing of colonial authorities. The pattern was depressingly predictable. Settlers would move into Aboriginal territory, Aboriginal people would resist, violence would escalate, and eventually Aboriginal groups would be killed, driven away, or forced onto missions and reserves. These frontier wars, as historians now call them, were rarely reported in detail by colonial newspapers, which preferred to portray Aboriginal resistance as isolated attacks by savage criminals rather than systematic defence of traditional lands. But the archaeological and oral historical evidence tells a different story. This was warfare on a continental scale, with Aboriginal casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. Some Aboriginal leaders emerged as brilliant military strategists who adapted quickly to European tactics and weapons. Pemulwuy, a Bidjigal warrior, led a guerrilla campaign against Sydney settlers that lasted over a decade. Jandamara in Western Australia and Namaluk in the Northern Territory organised resistance movements that tied up significant colonial military resources. These men were fighting for the survival of their people and their way of life, and they deserved to be remembered as heroes rather than the villains that colonial propaganda made them out to be. The European expansion wasn't limited to the mainland. Tasmania, known then as Van Diemen's Land, became the site of some of the most intensive colonization efforts in the British Empire. The island's climate was more familiar to European settlers, and its smaller size made it seem more manageable than the vast Australian continent. But Tasmania also became the site of one of history's most tragic examples of cultural destruction. The Aboriginal Tasmanians, who had lived in isolation from the mainland for over 10,000 years, had developed unique cultures and technologies perfectly adapted to their island home. When European settlers arrived in large numbers in the 1820s, the collision between these two societies was catastrophic. The Black War, as it became known, was a systematic campaign to remove Aboriginal Tasmanians from their traditional lands. George Augustus Robinson, a well-meaning but culturally blind missionary, convinced the remaining Aboriginal people to relocate to Flinders Island with promises of protection and support. What followed was a slow-motion genocide as disease, despair, and cultural destruction killed most of the relocated population within a generation. Truganini, often called the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person, watched her entire world disappear during her lifetime. Her story became a symbol of the broader tragedy unfolding across Australia as European settlement expanded. But recent historical research has revealed that Aboriginal Tasmanian culture didn't completely disappear, as was long believed. Some Aboriginal Tasmanians survived by integrating with European communities, and their descendants have maintained cultural connections and identity into the present day. The expansion of settlement also drove exploration of Australia's vast interior. The Blue Mountains, which had blocked westward expansion from Sydney for decades, were finally crossed in 1813 by Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson. Beyond the mountains, they found vast plains perfect for grazing, opening up enormous areas for settlement. This discovery triggered a wave of exploration that would continue for the rest of the 19th century. Men like Hamilton Hume, William Hovell, Thomas Mitchell, and Edward John Eyre pushed deeper and deeper into the continent, mapping rivers, mountain ranges, and plains that had never been seen by European eyes. Their expeditions were grueling tests of endurance and navigation skills, often lasting months and covering thousands of kilometers through completely unknown territory. But these explorations came at a cost that was rarely acknowledged at the time. European explorers relied heavily on Aboriginal guides who knew the location of water sources, safe routes through difficult terrain, and seasonal patterns that could mean the difference between life and death. Yet Aboriginal contributions to these expeditions were typically minimised or ignored entirely in official accounts, which preferred to portray European explorers as lone heroes conquering the wilderness through their own skill and courage. The most tragic of these exploration stories was the Burke and Wills expedition of 1860-61. Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills led a lavishly equipped expedition from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria, intending to cross the continent from south to north. Their expedition became a comedy of errors that ended in disaster when Burke's impatience and poor planning left most of the party dead in the desert. Yet even this failure revealed something important about Australia's emerging character. The public response to the Burke and Wills disaster was enormous. Rescue expeditions were mounted. Huge rewards were offered for information about the missing explorers. And when their bodies were finally recovered, they were given state funerals that attracted enormous crowds. The colony was developing a sense of shared identity and mutual responsibility that transcended the divisions between free settlers, emancipists, and even different colonies. By the 1840s, the transportation of convicts was beginning to wind down in most Australian colonies. The system had served its purpose. It had established viable settlements, created basic infrastructure, and provided the labour force needed to build a functioning economy. But Australia was changing, and the convict system was becoming an embarrassment rather than an asset. Free immigration was increasing as word spread that Australia offered opportunities for advancement that were impossible in the rigid class structures of Britain and Ireland. The discovery of gold in the 1850s would accelerate this transformation dramatically, But even before the gold rushes, Australia was attracting ambitious people who saw the colonies as places where hard work and intelligence mattered more than family connections and inherited wealth. The end of transportation marked the beginning of Australia's transformation from a collection of penal colonies into something approaching normal societies. But the legacy of the convict era would remain embedded in Australian culture for generations. The scepticism of authority, the egalitarian spirit that rejected rigid class distinctions, and the belief that everyone deserved a fair go, regardless of their background, all traced back to those early decades when former criminals and their guards worked together to build a new society in an impossible place. As the 1850s dawned, Australia stood on the brink of another transformation that would be even more dramatic than the transition from Aboriginal homeland to British colony. The discovery of gold would bring hundreds of thousands of new immigrants, create enormous wealth, and establish the foundations of the modern Australian nation. But that story, with all its excitement, opportunity, and tragedy, deserves its own chapter in this epic tale of human ambition and endurance. The stage was set for the next great act in Australian history, and the players were already taking their positions. Aboriginal peoples, still fighting for survival and recognition of their rights. Emancipated convicts, building businesses and families in their adopted homeland. Free settlers, pursuing dreams of prosperity and respectability. Government officials, trying to maintain order and British authority over increasingly independent-minded populations. None of them could imagine what was about to unfold across the continent. The age of gold was coming, and with it would come changes that would reshape not just Australia, but the entire balance of power in the Pacific region. The quiet colonies that had struggled for survival were about to become some of the wealthiest places on Earth, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. The year was 1851, and Edward Hargreaves was about to change everything. This former publican from Bathurst had spent 2 frustrating years in the California goldfields, watching Americans strike it rich while he found nothing but fool's gold and broken dreams. But Hargreaves had noticed something during his time in California, something that would make him one of the most important figures in Australian history. The landscape around the Californian goldfields looked remarkably similar to the country around Bathurst, west of the Blue Mountains. The same type of rock formations, the same geological patterns, the same kind of creek beds where gold might settle after being washed down from ancient reefs. If gold existed in California, Hargreaves reasoned, why wouldn't it exist in similar terrain back home in New South Wales? When Hargreaves returned to Australia in January 1851, he was a man possessed by a single idea. He headed straight for the country around Bathurst, armed with the prospecting techniques he had learned in California, and an unshakable conviction that he was about to make the discovery of the century. He enlisted the help of local men who knew the area, promising them shares in whatever riches they might find. On February 12, 1851, at a place called Lewis Ponds Creek, Hargreaves and his companions made the discovery that would transform Australia forever. Using a simple pan and the washing techniques he had mastered in California, Hargreaves pulled several small but unmistakable pieces of gold from the creek bed. He held up the largest piece, about the size of a grain of wheat, and spoke words that would echo through Australian history. This is a memorable day in the history of New South Wales. I shall be a baronet, you will be knighted, and my old horse will be stuffed, put in a glass case, and sent to the British Museum. Hargreaves wasn't entirely wrong about the historical significance of that moment, though his predictions about personal honours proved somewhat optimistic. What he had unleashed was a gold rush that would bring more dramatic change to Australia in a single decade than the previous 60 years of slow colonial development had achieved. The news of Hargreaves' discovery spread through the colony like wildfire. Within weeks, thousands of men were abandoning their jobs and heading for the goldfields around Bathurst. Shopkeepers closed their stores, farmers left their crops unharvested, and even police officers resigned their positions to try their luck at the diggings. The colonial government watched in alarm as entire towns emptied overnight. leaving essential services undermanned and the economy in chaos. But this was just the beginning. The real excitement started when even richer goldfields were discovered in Victoria. In June 1851, gold was found at Clunes, followed quickly by strikes at Ballarat and Bendigo that made the New South Wales discoveries look modest by comparison. Victoria was experiencing the richest gold rush in human history, and word was spreading around the globe. The impact was immediate and staggering. Ships began arriving in Melbourne and Sydney, carrying hopeful prospectors from every corner of the world. Americans who had missed out on the California gold rush saw Australia as their second chance. Chinese miners, facing persecution and declining opportunities in California, began making the journey across the Pacific in their thousands. Europeans who had never dreamed of leaving their home villages suddenly found themselves booking passage to the other side of the world. The statistics tell the story of this extraordinary migration. In 1851, the population of Victoria was about 77,000. By 1861, it had exploded to over 540,000. Melbourne, which had been a small colonial town, became one of the largest cities in the British Empire almost overnight. The transformation was so rapid that basic infrastructure couldn't keep pace with the influx of people. The goldfields themselves became some of the most cosmopolitan places on Earth. At Ballarat and Bendigo, you could hear dozens of languages being spoken in a single day. Chinese miners worked alongside German immigrants. Irish Catholics prospected next to English Protestants. And American veterans of the California fields shared techniques with Aboriginal guides who knew the local country better than anyone. This diversity created both opportunity and tension. The egalitarian spirit of the goldfields, where a man's success depended on his luck and hard work rather than his background, appealed to people who had been constrained by rigid social hierarchies in their home countries. Former agricultural labourers struck it rich and bought properties that made them wealthier than the landed gentry they had once served. Educated men who had never done manual labour found themselves working alongside illiterate diggers who taught them the practical skills needed to survive on the goldfields. But the goldfields also became pressure cookers of racial and cultural conflict. The Chinese miners, in particular, faced systematic discrimination and violence from European prospectors who resented their success and different customs. Anti-Chinese riots broke out at several goldfields, fueled by fears that Chinese miners were taking gold that should rightfully belong to European settlers. These conflicts would plant the seeds of the White Australia policy that would dominate Australian immigration for the next century. The most significant confrontation between miners and authority came at Ballarat in 1854, in an event that would become central to Australian national mythology. The immediate cause was the mining licence system imposed by the colonial government. Every prospector had to purchase expensive licences and carry them at all times, subject to frequent checks by licence inspectors backed up by armed police. The miners hated this system for multiple reasons. The licences were expensive, costing more than many miners earned in a month during lean periods. They had to be purchased whether or not a miner found any gold, making them a tax on hope rather than success. The licence checks were often conducted in a heavy-handed manner by officials who showed little respect for the miners' dignity or rights. Tensions reached a breaking point when a miner named James Scobie was murdered outside Bentley's Hotel in Ballarat. When the suspected killers were acquitted in what appeared to be a corrupt trial, and the hotel owner who was widely believed to be involved was given only a token fine, the miners' anger exploded into open rebellion. Led by Peter Lalore, an Irish-born civil engineer, the miners organised what they called the Ballarat Reform League. They demanded the abolition of mining licences, the right to vote for all men regardless of property ownership, and representation in Parliament. When the government refused their demands, the miners decided to take direct action. On November 29, 1854, about 1,000 miners gathered at Bakery Hill and swore an oath under what they called the Southern Cross flag. "We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties." They then marched to a place called the Eureka Lead, where they built a rough stockade and prepared to resist government authority by force. The Eureka Stockade, as it became known, was never intended to be a major military fortification. It was more a symbolic gesture than a serious attempt at revolution. The miners were making a political statement about their rights as British subjects and their refusal to accept taxation without representation. Most of the original protesters had drifted away by the time government forces arrived, leaving only about 150 men inside the stockade. On December 3rd, 1854, government troops and police attacked the stockade in a brief but bloody confrontation. The battle lasted only about 20 minutes, but when the shooting stopped, at least 27 people were dead and many more wounded. Peter Lalore escaped, though he lost an arm in the fighting. Many of the surviving miners were arrested and charged with high treason. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The government's heavy-handed response to what had been essentially a protest movement backfired spectacularly. Public opinion throughout the colony turned strongly in favour of the miners. When the treason trials were held, Melbourne juries refused to convict any of the accused men, despite overwhelming evidence of their participation in the rebellion. The government got the message. Within months, mining licenses were abolished and replaced with a much cheaper miner's right that also carried the privilege of voting in colonial elections. Peter Lalore, the leader of the rebellion, was elected to Parliament and eventually became Speaker of the Victorian Legislative Assembly. The Eureka flag became a symbol of Australian democratic values and resistance to arbitrary authority. The Eureka Stockade became a founding myth of Australian democracy, proving that ordinary people could stand up to government oppression and win. It established principles that would become central to Australian political culture: that everyone deserves a fair go, that authority must be earned rather than simply imposed, and that working people have the right to organise and fight for their interests. But the gold rushes created changes that went far beyond politics. They transformed Australia's economy from a colonial outpost dependent on Britain into a major player in global markets. Australian gold-funded railway construction across 3 continents, financed industrial development in Europe and America, and made Melbourne one of the wealthiest cities in the world. The social changes were equally dramatic. The gold rushes created Australia's first truly multicultural society, bringing together people from dozens of countries who had to learn to work and live together despite their different languages, religions, and customs. The Chinese community, despite facing discrimination, established businesses, schools, and cultural organisations that enriched Australian society and created lasting connections between Australia and Asia. Women's roles also began to change on the goldfields. While most prospectors were men, women found opportunities as boarding house keepers, laundresses, cooks, and storekeepers serving the mining communities. Some women even worked claims themselves, either alongside their husbands or as independent operators. The goldfields offered women economic opportunities that were almost unthinkable in the rigid social structures of mid-19th century Britain. The environmental impact of the gold rushes was enormous and largely irreversible. Entire landscapes were transformed as miners dug thousands of shafts, diverted rivers, and used high-pressure water cannons to wash away hillsides in search of gold-bearing gravel. Forests were cleared to provide timber for mine shafts and fuel for steam engines. Native animals were hunted to near extinction to feed the mining camps. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on Aboriginal peoples. The gold rushes brought tens of thousands of Europeans into areas that had previously seen little white settlement. Aboriginal communities that had survived the initial wave of colonisation now faced overwhelming pressure from miners who had no interest in negotiating land use or respecting traditional boundaries. The violence that erupted was often systematic and brutal. Mining communities organised what they euphemistically called dispersal operations to drive Aboriginal people away from goldfields. These operations were often little more than massacres, though they were rarely reported as such in the colonial press. Aboriginal resistance was portrayed as unprovoked attacks on innocent miners, justifying further retaliation. Some Aboriginal people tried to adapt to the new circumstances by working for wages in the mining industry or establishing businesses serving the mining communities. But the opportunities were limited, and the cultural disruption was devastating. Traditional food sources were destroyed by mining operations, sacred sites were desecrated or obliterated, and entire communities were forced to relocate to missions or reserves far from their traditional countries. The gold rushes also accelerated the push for self-government in the Australian colonies. The massive increase in population and wealth made the colonies more important to Britain, but also more difficult to govern from London. Colonial parliaments gained greater powers, and there was growing talk of eventual federation between the separate colonies. Victoria, enriched by gold wealth, became particularly assertive in demanding greater autonomy from British control. The colony's politicians argued that they understood local conditions better than officials in London, and that they should have the right to make decisions about immigration, trade, and internal affairs without interference from imperial authorities. The discovery of gold also changed Australia's relationship with the rest of the world. No longer was Australia seen as merely a dumping ground for Britain's unwanted convicts. It was now a land of opportunity that attracted voluntary immigrants from across the globe. Australian gold finance development projects from London to San Francisco, and Australian mining companies began investing in goldfields in other countries. By the 1860s, the initial frenzy of the gold rushes was beginning to subside. The easily accessible surface gold had been picked over, and mining was becoming more capital-intensive and technically sophisticated. Individual prospectors with simple tools were being replaced by companies with steam-powered equipment and the resources to sink deep shafts and process large amounts of ore. But the gold rushes had created something that would outlast the goldfields themselves, a new kind of Australian society. The immigrants who had come for gold often stayed to establish farms, businesses, and families. They brought skills, capital, and connections that accelerated Australia's development in every field, from agriculture to manufacturing to the arts. The cities that had grown up to service the goldfields became permanent centres of commerce and culture. Melbourne, in particular, used its gold wealth to build magnificent public buildings, establish universities and libraries, and attract artists and intellectuals from around the world. By the 1880s, Melbourne was being called the Paris of the South Pacific, a cosmopolitan centre that rivaled any city outside Europe or North America. The political legacy of the gold rushes was equally important. The democratic reforms won at Eureka spread to other colonies, establishing the principle of manhood suffrage and responsible government throughout Australia. The gold rushes had created a society that was more egalitarian, more democratic, and more confident than anything that had existed in Australia before. But perhaps most importantly, the gold rushes had created a sense of Australian identity that transcended the boundaries between the separate colonies. People who had come from dozens of different countries and backgrounds had shared the common experience of seeking their fortunes in the Australian goldfields. They had worked together, fought together, and built communities together in ways that created bonds stronger than their original national loyalties. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in Australian history, the movement toward federation and the creation of a single Australian nation. The wealth, population, and confidence created by the gold rushes would provide the foundation for this political transformation. But first, the colonies would have to overcome decades of rivalry, suspicion, and competing interests to forge a common future. The man who would emerge as the leading advocate for Australian federation was a bearded Victorian politician named Alfred Deakin, whose vision of a united Australia would inspire a generation of leaders to put aside their colonial loyalties in favour of a larger dream. But that story with all its political manoeuvring, passionate debates, and ultimate triumph, would require its own telling. As the 1860s drew to a close, Australia had been transformed beyond recognition from the struggling penal settlements of just 2 generations earlier. A land that had once supported perhaps 300,000 Aboriginal people now housed over 1 million immigrants from around the world. Cities that had not existed when the first fleet arrived were now among the largest in the British Empire. Industries that had been unimaginable in the convict era were generating wealth that rivaled the most prosperous regions of Europe or America. The foundations of modern Australia had been laid in the crucible of the goldfields, where people from every continent had learned to work together despite their differences, where democratic ideals had been tested in the fires of conflict, and where the promise of a fair go for everyone willing to work for it had become the defining characteristic of Australian society. But the story was far from over. The greatest challenges and achievements still lay ahead, as the separate colonies struggled to overcome their differences and create a single nation that could take its place among the great powers of the world. The adventure was just beginning. The dreams of federation that had flickered in the minds of visionary politicians for decades were about to face their greatest test. By the 1870s, the separate Australian colonies had grown into prosperous, confident societies, but they were also fiercely protective of their individual interests. Each colony had its own government, its own trade policies, its own military forces, and most importantly, its own sense of identity that often put it at odds with its neighbours. The challenge was enormous. How do you convince 6 separate colonies, each convinced of its own superiority, to surrender their independence and join together under a single national government? How do you overcome decades of rivalry, trade disputes, and political jealousy to create something that had never existed before, a unified Australian nation? The obstacles seemed insurmountable. New South Wales, as the mother colony, believed it had the natural right to lead any federation. Victoria, flush with gold wealth, considered itself the most progressive and successful colony. Queensland was focused on its sugar industry and tropical development. Western Australia was so isolated that it barely seemed part of the same continent. South Australia prided itself on being the only colony founded by free settlers rather than convicts. Tasmania struggled to maintain its relevance despite being the smallest and poorest of the colonies. Trade wars between the colonies had created barriers that were often higher than those between completely separate countries. A shipment of goods travelling from Sydney to Melbourne faced more customs duties and bureaucratic obstacles than one going from Sydney to London. Railway lines stopped at colonial borders, forcing passengers and freight to transfer to different systems with different gauges. Military forces couldn't coordinate effectively because each colony maintained its own separate command structure. But beneath these practical problems lay deeper cultural and political divisions. The colonies had developed distinct identities over their short histories. New South Wales saw itself as the natural leader, with Sydney as the obvious capital of any future nation. Victoria considered Melbourne the most sophisticated and culturally advanced city in Australia, making it the logical choice for a federal capital. The smaller colonies feared being dominated by their larger neighbours and losing the autonomy they had fought so hard to achieve. Religious divisions added another layer of complexity. The Irish Catholic population, concentrated heavily in certain colonies, remained suspicious of Protestant-dominated governments and worried about discrimination in a federated Australia. The various Protestant denominations had their own concerns about maintaining their influence and protecting their interests. These religious tensions reflected deeper anxieties about identity, loyalty, and belonging that would complicate every aspect of the federation debate. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source: fear. During the 1880s, European powers were expanding their colonial empires across the Pacific, and Australians began to worry that their isolated continent might become a target for foreign conquest. France was establishing colonies in New Caledonia and the New Hebrides. Germany was moving into New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Russia's expanding Pacific Fleet was causing alarm throughout the British Empire. These fears crystallized in 1883 when Queensland, acting without consultation with the other colonies or the British government, attempted to annex the entire eastern half of New Guinea to prevent German colonization. The British government was furious at this unauthorized action. But the incident highlighted how vulnerable the separate colonies were when acting independently. If Australia was going to defend itself against foreign threats, the colonies would need to coordinate their efforts in ways that their current fragmented system made impossible. The man who emerged as the most eloquent advocate for federation was Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales. Parkes was a remarkable figure, a self-made man who had arrived in Australia as a poor immigrant and worked his way up to become one of the most powerful politicians in the colony. He combined practical political skills with genuine vision, understanding both the day-to-day challenges of colonial government and the larger historical forces that were reshaping the world. In October 1889, Parkes delivered a speech at Tenterfield that would become legendary in Australian political history. Standing before a crowd of local citizens in this small New South Wales town, Parkes outlined his vision for a federated Australia with a passion and clarity that cut through decades of colonial rivalry and suspicion. The great question for Australia, Parkes declared, was whether it would remain a collection of weak, divided colonies vulnerable to foreign domination, or unite to become a strong, independent nation capable of defending itself and pursuing its own destiny. The choice was that simple and that momentous. Australia could continue to drift along as 6 separate colonies, increasingly irrelevant in a world dominated by great powers. Or it could seize the opportunity to create something unprecedented, a democratic federation that combined local self-government with national unity. Parkes understood that federation wouldn't happen through grand speeches alone. It would require patient negotiation, careful compromise, and the gradual building of trust between colonies that had spent decades viewing each other as rivals. He began organizing a series of conferences where colonial leaders could meet to discuss practical steps toward union. The first of these gatherings, the National Australasian Convention, met in Sydney in 1891. The delegates who assembled represented the political elite of colonial Australia: premiers, judges, leading lawyers, and influential businessmen. But they also represented fundamentally different visions of what federation might look like. Some delegates favoured a highly centralised system where a national government would have broad powers over defence, foreign policy, trade, and immigration. Others insisted on a more decentralised approach that would preserve significant powers for the colonial governments. The debate over states' rights versus federal authority would dominate Australian politics for generations, but it began in earnest in those convention sessions of the 1890s. The convention delegates faced technical challenges that seemed almost impossible to resolve. How would representation in a federal parliament be determined? Should it be based on population, giving the largest colonies the most influence, or should each colony have equal representation regardless of size? How would federal revenues be raised and distributed? What powers should remain with the colonial governments, and what should be transferred to the new federal authority? These weren't just abstract constitutional questions. They involved real conflicts of interest that could make or break the federation movement. New South Wales and Victoria, with the largest populations and most developed economies, naturally favoured representation based on population. The smaller colonies insisted on some form of equal representation to prevent themselves from being overwhelmed. Queensland's sugar industry depended on Pacific Islander labour that other colonies wanted to ban. Western Australia's mining interests needed different policies than Victoria's manufacturing sector. The 1891 Convention produced a draft constitution that was a masterpiece of compromise and creative federalism. It established a bicameral federal parliament with a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate with equal representation for each state. It divided powers between federal and state governments in ways that preserved local autonomy while creating effective national authority. It included provisions for a federal judiciary, a national capital, but creating a constitution on paper was much, and even the possibility of admitting new states as the nation expand easier than getting it accepted by the colonial parliaments and voters. When the draft constitution was submitted to the colonial governments, it encountered immediate resistance. Politicians who had seemed supportive in convention suddenly discovered problems that made ratification impossible. Trade interests that had been ignored during the negotiations mobilized opposition. Newspapers that had initially endorsed federation began publishing articles highlighting its dangers and disadvantages. The federation movement seemed to stall just when success appeared within reach. Years passed with little apparent progress as colonial politicians found excuses to delay consideration of the draft constitution. Critics began to argue that federation was an impossible dream, that the colonies were too different and too set in their ways to ever unite voluntarily. But the external pressures that had originally sparked interest in federation were intensifying rather than diminishing. The 1890s brought a series of economic crises that demonstrated how vulnerable the individual colonies were to global market forces. The Great Maritime Strike of 1890 paralyzed shipping across all the colonies, showing how industrial disputes could spread rapidly across colonial boundaries. Economic depression in the mid-1890s hit some colonies harder than others, but none could escape the interconnected effects of falling commodity prices and reduced investment. More ominously, the strategic situation in the Pacific was deteriorating from Australia's perspective. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought American naval power into the Western Pacific for the first time. Japan was emerging as a major regional power after its victory over China in 1894-95. European colonial competition was intensifying, with incidents between rival powers becoming more frequent and more serious. These developments breathed new life into the federation movement by demonstrating that Australia's security and prosperity required coordinated action that the existing colonial system couldn't provide. A new generation of political leaders emerged who were less attached to colonial loyalties and more focused on creating the national institutions Australia needed to thrive in the 20th century. The breakthrough came in 1897, when a second constitutional convention assembled, this time with delegates elected directly by the voters in each colony rather than appointed by colonial governments. This gave the convention greater democratic legitimacy and helped insulate the delegates from some of the political pressures that had derailed earlier efforts. The 1897-98 convention was led by figures like Edmund Barton from New South Wales, Alfred Deakin from Victoria, and Charles Kingston from South Australia. Men who combined practical political experience with genuine commitment to the federation cause. They understood that success would require not just constitutional expertise, but the ability to sell federation to voters who remained skeptical about surrendering colonial independence. The revised constitution that emerged from this convention addressed many of the concerns that had doomed earlier efforts. It provided stronger guarantees for state rights while creating effective federal authority over defense, foreign policy, and interstate commerce. It included provisions for federal takeover of colonial debts, which was crucial for the smaller colonies. It established mechanisms for resolving disputes between states and the federal government. Most importantly, the new constitution included a provision that it would only come into effect if approved by voters in referendums held in each colony. This democratic requirement, while making federation more difficult to achieve, also gave it greater legitimacy by ensuring that union would be based on popular consent rather than elite manipulation. The referendum campaigns that followed were among the most intense political contests in Australian history. Federation supporters organised massive rallies, published countless pamphlets, and used every available medium to promote their cause. They argued that federation would make Australia stronger, more prosperous, and better able to defend itself against foreign threats. They painted vivid pictures of the great nation that Australia could become if its people had the courage to unite. Federation opponents were equally active. warning that union would destroy colonial identity, impose unfair tax burdens, and create a distant federal government that would be unresponsive to local needs. They played on fears that federation would benefit the larger colonies at the expense of the smaller ones, that it would lead to corruption and inefficiency, and that it would compromise the British connection that remains central to most Australians' sense of identity. The first round of referendums, held in 1899, produced mixed results that seemed to confirm the critics' pessimism. New South Wales voters rejected federation, though by a narrow margin. Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania approved it decisively. Queensland didn't participate, and Western Australia remained undecided. It appeared that federation might succeed in some colonies while failing in others, creating a partial union that would solve none of the problems that had motivated the movement in the first place. But the federation leaders refused to give up. They identified the specific concerns that had led to rejection in New South Wales and worked to address them through amendments and compromises. They intensified their campaign in Queensland and Western Australia, adapting their arguments to local conditions and interests. Most importantly, they maintained the momentum and enthusiasm that had built up around the Federation cause, preventing the movement from collapsing in the face of this temporary setback. The second round of referendums, held in 1900, produced the decisive breakthrough that Federation supporters had been seeking. New South Wales reversed its earlier decision and voted for Federation by a comfortable margin. Queensland joined the movement, influenced partly by fears of being left out of a union that seemed increasingly inevitable. All four participating colonies approved federation by substantial majorities, creating the legal and political foundation for the new nation. Western Australia remained the final holdout, its voters and politicians still uncertain about joining a federation dominated by the eastern colonies. The discovery of gold in the 1890s had made Western Australia prosperous and confident, but also more aware of how different its interests were from those of the manufacturing and agricultural regions in the east. There were serious discussions about whether Western Australia might be better off remaining a separate British colony rather than joining the Australian Federation. The breakthrough in Western Australia came when Federation supporters convinced voters that isolation was no longer a viable option in the modern world. The new nation would control defence, foreign policy, and interstate commerce regardless of whether Western Australia participated. The colony could either join as a founding member with full rights and representation, or it could remain outside and find itself increasingly marginalised as the Federation developed its own policies and institutions. In July 1900, Western Australian voters approved Federation by a decisive margin, completing the process that had begun with Henry Parkes's speech in Tenterfield more than a decade earlier. All 6 colonies had agreed to unite under a single national government, creating the Commonwealth of Australia through one of the most remarkable exercises in democratic nation-building in modern history. The new nation that emerged from this process was unlike anything that had existed before. It was the first country to be created through peaceful democratic processes rather than war or revolution. It combined features of the British parliamentary system with American-style federalism, creating institutions that balanced local autonomy with national unity. It established one of the world's most democratic political systems, with universal manhood suffrage and secret ballot voting that was still rare in other countries. But the new Australia also carried forward many of the limitations and contradictions of the colonial societies that had created it. Aboriginal Australians were excluded from citizenship and voting rights, continuing the pattern of dispossession and marginalisation that had begun with European settlement. The White Australia policy, designed to prevent non-European immigration, reflected racial prejudices that were widespread among the colonial populations. Women remained excluded from federal voting rights, though some colonies had already granted them political equality. The Federation of Australia represented both tremendous achievement and missed opportunity. The political leaders who created it had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to unite 6 separate colonies into a single nation. They had established democratic institutions that would prove remarkably durable and effective. They had created the legal and political framework for Australia to develop into a major regional power, but they had also failed to address some of the fundamental injustices and limitations that had characterized colonial Australian society. The new nation would spend much of the next century grappling with the consequences of decisions made and not made during the federation process. The exclusion of Aboriginal Australians from citizenship would remain a source of conflict and injustice for generations. The White Australia policy would shape immigration patterns and international relations for decades to come. As the 19th century drew to a close, Australia stood on the threshold of nationhood with a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and tremendous potential. The colonial era was ending, but the kind of nation that would emerge from federation remained to be determined. The institutions were in place, the legal framework was established, and the democratic processes were functioning. But the real work of building a nation that could fulfill the promises and overcome the limitations of federation was just beginning. On January 1st, 1901, in a ceremony in Centennial Park in Sydney, Lord Hopetoun would swear in Edmund Barton as Australia's first Prime Minister, officially bringing the Commonwealth of Australia into existence. But that moment of triumph would mark the beginning, rather than the end of the Australian story. The young nation would face challenges that its founders could barely imagine. World wars that would test its survival, economic crises that would threaten its prosperity, and social movements that would force it to confront the contradictions and injustices built into its founding principles. The Australia that emerged from federation was confident, democratic, and prosperous, but it was also incomplete. The real test of the federation experiment would come in the decades that followed, as Australians discovered what kind of nation they had created and what kind of people they wanted to become. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a sense of limitless possibility for the newborn Commonwealth of Australia. On that historic New Year's Day in 1901, as Lord Hopetoun administered the oath of office to Edmund Barton in Sydney's Centennial Park, the gathered crowd witnessed something extraordinary: the birth of a nation through democratic consensus rather than conquest or revolution. But what they couldn't foresee was that this young country, barely hours old, would soon face trials that would forge its character in ways the Founding Fathers never imagined. The early years of federation were a honeymoon period of sorts, filled with the excitement of nation building and the challenges of making 6 colonial governments work together as one. Prime Minister Barton faced the monumental task of creating federal institutions from scratch, while managing the competing interests of states that had spent decades viewing each other as rivals. Every decision, from the location of the national capital to the design of federal courts, became a delicate balancing act between competing regional interests. The question of where to locate the federal capital became one of the most contentious issues facing the new nation. Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 largest cities, each believed they deserved the honour of housing the national government. The rivalry was so intense that it threatened to undermine the entire federation project. The solution was typically Australian in its pragmatism. They would build an entirely new capital city somewhere between the 2 rivals, close enough to Sydney to satisfy New South Wales, but far enough away to appease Victoria. The site chosen for this new capital was a sheep station in the Monaro region of New South Wales, a place of rolling hills and clear streams that seemed to embody the pastoral ideal that many Australians still cherished. They would call it Canberra, from an Aboriginal word meaning meeting place, though the irony of using an Indigenous name for a capital that excluded Aboriginal people from citizenship was lost on most contemporaries. But before Canberra could be built, the new nation had to prove it could survive the storms that were already gathering on the international horizon. The early 1900s were a time of growing tension between the great powers, as imperial rivalries intensified and military technology advanced at a frightening pace. Australia, despite its geographic isolation, would not be able to remain aloof from these global conflicts. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. In 1899, war had broken out between Britain and the Boer republics in South Africa, and the Australian colonies had sent volunteer contingents to support the imperial cause. Now, as a federated nation, Australia faced its first decision about military involvement overseas. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of young Australians volunteering to serve in what they saw as their duty to the British Empire. The Australian performance in the Second Boer War was a source of immense national pride. The mounted infantry units, drawing on skills developed in the harsh Australian bush, proved particularly effective in the guerrilla warfare that characterised the later stages of the conflict. Men like Harry Breaker Morant became folk heroes, though Morant's later court-martial and execution for war crimes would complicate the narrative of Australian military virtue. More importantly, the Boer War gave Australians their first taste of fighting as a united nation rather than separate colonial forces. The shared experience of service, sacrifice, and loss began to create bonds that transcended state boundaries and colonial loyalties. When the war ended in 1902, Australia had established itself as a reliable partner in imperial defence, but it had also begun to develop a distinct military identity. The confidence gained from the South African experience encouraged Australian leaders to take a more assertive role in regional affairs. The Pacific Ocean, which had once seemed like a protective moat isolating Australia from global conflicts, was increasingly viewed as a highway that could bring threats as easily as opportunities. Japanese naval power was growing rapidly after their stunning victory over Russia in 1904-05. And Australian strategists began to worry about the security of their long, vulnerable coastline. These security concerns drove the new nation to make one of its most controversial early decisions: the implementation of the White Australia policy. This wasn't simply a matter of racial prejudice, though prejudice certainly played a role. It was also a response to genuine fears about labour competition from Asian immigrants and strategic concerns about divided loyalties in the event of conflict with Asian powers. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 was carefully crafted to avoid explicitly mentioning race, instead requiring immigrants to pass a dictation test in a European language. The language could be chosen by the immigration officer, making it possible to exclude anyone deemed undesirable, regardless of their actual literacy. A Chinese scholar could be asked to write in Gaelic, while a preferred European immigrant might be tested in their native tongue. This policy had profound consequences for Australia's development. It created a more homogeneous society than would have existed under open immigration, but it also deprived the nation of the talents and perspectives that Asian immigrants might have contributed. More ominously, it established racial exclusion as a fundamental principle of Australian nationalism, creating tensions with Asian neighbours that would complicate foreign relations for decades to come. The White Australia policy was complemented by other nation-building measures that reflected the new government's determination to create a unified Australian identity. The Pacific Island Labourers Act of 1901 mandated the deportation of thousands of Pacific Islanders who had been working in Queensland's sugar plantations, despite many having lived in Australia for decades and established families and communities. This forced repatriation was presented as a humanitarian measure to end what critics called slave labour, but it also reflected the government's commitment to creating a society based on white wage labour rather than indentured or semi-forced labour systems. The economic disruption was severe, particularly in Queensland, where entire industries had to be reorganised around higher wages and better conditions. Fed white workers demanding early federal governments also moved quickly to establish national institutions that would bind the country together. The Commonwealth Public Service was created to administer federal programs with professional standards and merit-based recruitment. The High Court of Australia was established as the final arbiter of constitutional disputes and the guardian of federal law. Most importantly, the Commonwealth began taking over colonial debts and establishing a national financial system that would support economic development. These institutional innovations were accompanied by social reforms that reflected the progressive ideals of many Federation leaders. The Conciliation and Arbitration Act of 1904 established a system of industrial courts that would set wages and working conditions for entire industries, preventing the destructive labour conflicts that had plagued the colonies in the 1890s. This system, unique in the world at the time, gave Australia some of the highest wages and best working conditions of any industrial nation. The arbitration system also reflected distinctly Australian values about fairness and equality. The concept of the basic wage, a minimum income that would allow a working man to support a wife and 3 children in frugal comfort, became a cornerstone of Australian industrial relations. This wasn't just an economic policy. It was a statement about the kind of society Australia wanted to become. One where hard work would be rewarded with dignity and security. Women's rights became another arena where Australia led the world. South Australia had granted women the vote in 1894, and Western Australia followed in 1899. The new federal constitution initially excluded women from federal elections, but the Franchise Act of 1902 extended voting rights to all white women, making Australia one of the first nations to achieve universal adult suffrage. This achievement was somewhat tarnished by the continued exclusion of Aboriginal Australians from citizenship and voting rights. The Constitution specifically allowed states to exclude races deemed unsuitable for voting, and all states exercised this power to disenfranchise Indigenous people. The contradiction between Australia's democratic ideals and its treatment of Aboriginal peoples would remain a source of tension and injustice for generations to come. The economic foundations of the new nation were being transformed as rapidly as its political institutions. The gold rushes had created substantial wealth, but they had also demonstrated the dangers of depending too heavily on mineral exports. Australian leaders were determined to build a more diversified economy that could support the growing population and provide stable employment for the working class that formed the backbone of their political coalition. Manufacturing became a national priority, supported by protective tariffs that shielded Australian industries from foreign competition. The policy was controversial, as it raised the cost of consumer goods and created inefficiencies that would persist for decades. But it also fostered the development of industries that employed thousands of workers and reduced Australia's dependence on imports from Britain and other countries. Agriculture remained crucial to the national economy, but it was being revolutionised by new technologies and scientific methods. The development of drought-resistant wheat varieties opened vast areas of marginal land to cultivation. Refrigerated shipping allowed Australian beef and lamb to reach markets in Britain and Asia. Irrigation schemes began to transform arid regions into productive farming areas, though often at the expense of river systems that Aboriginal communities had managed sustainably for thousands of years. The social fabric of Australia was also evolving rapidly, as the country attracted new waves of immigration from Britain and Ireland. Unlike the gold rush era, when single men had dominated the immigrant population, the new immigration was increasingly composed of families seeking permanent settlement. These immigrants brought skills, capital, and cultural traditions that enriched Australian society, while also creating new challenges of integration and identity formation. The new immigrants settled primarily in the growing cities, which were becoming centres of industry, culture, and political power. Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and Perth developed distinctive characters as they competed for population, investment, and federal government attention. Regional cities like Newcastle, Wollongong, and Geelong became important industrial centres, while smaller towns throughout the countryside served as focal points for agricultural development. This rapid urbanisation created both opportunities and problems. Cities offered employment, education, and cultural amenities that were impossible to provide in rural areas. But they also concentrated poverty, created public health challenges, and fostered social problems that rural communities had rarely experienced. Housing shortages, inadequate sanitation, and industrial pollution became serious concerns that required government intervention on an unprecedented scale. The cultural life of the new nation was flourishing as Australians began to develop distinctly national forms of expression in literature, art, and popular entertainment. Writers like Henry Lawson and A.B. Banjo Patterson captured the experiences and values of ordinary Australians in poems and stories that resonated with readers across the country. Their work celebrated the bush, mateship, and the struggles of working people, while also critiquing the social pretensions and political corruption that they saw as threats to Australian democracy. Artists like Tom Roberts, Arthur Streeton, and Charles Conder were developing a distinctly Australian approach to landscape painting that captured the unique light and colours of the continent. Their work helped Australians see their environment with new eyes, appreciating the beauty of landscapes that European-trained artists had often dismissed as monotonous or harsh. Popular culture was also becoming more distinctly Australian as the country developed its own sporting traditions, musical styles, and forms of entertainment. Australian rules football emerged as a uniquely national sport that combined elements of various football codes with innovations suited to Australian conditions. Cricket remained hugely popular, but Australian teams were developing playing styles and strategies that reflected national characteristics of aggression, innovation, and refusal to be intimidated by established authority. The media played a crucial role in creating national consciousness as newspapers, magazines, and eventually radio began to connect Australians across the vast distances that separated their communities. National news services allowed people in Perth to follow events in Brisbane, while serialised novels and popular features created shared cultural experiences that transcended state boundaries. Education became another priority for the new nation as leaders recognised that democracy required an informed citizenry and economic development demanded skilled workers. State education systems were expanded and standardised, while universities in Melbourne, Sydney and Adelaide began to develop programs that addressed distinctly Australian needs and conditions. Technical education received particular emphasis as the country sought to build the skilled workforce needed for industrial development. But beneath all these positive developments, tensions were building that would soon test the young nation's resilience and unity. The global situation was deteriorating rapidly as European powers formed opposing alliance systems and engaged in an arms race that made war increasingly likely. Australia's ties to Britain meant that any major European conflict would automatically involve the Dominion, regardless of whether Australians had any direct interest in the disputes that triggered hostilities. Labour relations were also becoming more contentious as workers organised more effectively and employers resisted demands for higher wages and better conditions. The arbitration system had prevented some conflicts, but it couldn't resolve the fundamental tension between capital and labour that was intensifying as Australia industrialised. Strikes became larger and more frequent, while employers began to organise their own associations to resist union demands. Political divisions were deepening as well, as the initial enthusiasm for federation gave way to partisan competition between emerging political parties. The Labour Party, representing the interests of urban workers and small farmers, was gaining strength and confidence. The Liberal Party, led by Alfred Deakin, represented middle-class and business interests while trying to maintain the reformist spirit that had driven federation. Conservative forces, uncomfortable with both liberal reforms and labour militancy, were organising their own political movement. These domestic tensions would soon be overshadowed by international crisis, but they were already shaping the kind of nation Australia was becoming. The optimism and confidence of the early federation years were giving way to a more complex understanding of the challenges facing the young country. Australians were discovering that creating a nation was easier than governing one, and that the ideals that had inspired federation would be tested by harsh realities that the founding fathers had barely imagined. As 1914 approached, Australia had established itself as a prosperous, democratic nation with strong institutions and a growing sense of national identity. But it remained fundamentally British in its political culture, economic orientation, and international loyalties. The great test of whether Australia could maintain its values and interests while fulfilling its imperial obligations was about to begin. And the outcome would determine not just the country's future, but the kind of people Australians would become. The stage was set for the most traumatic and transformative experience in Australian history up to that point. The Great War was coming, and with it was southern continent. But distance meant nothing when duty called. Prime Minister Andrew Fisher's response was immediate and unequivocal. Australia would support Britain, to our last man and our last shilling. But these weren't just empty words of political rhetoric. They represented a commitment that would transform Australian society in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The young nation that had celebrated its peaceful birth was about to discover what it meant to pay the ultimate price for its place in the world. The response from ordinary Australians was overwhelming. Recruiting offices across the country were besieged by young men eager to serve king and empire. In Melbourne, queues stretched for blocks as men waited to enlist. In Sydney, recruitment rallies filled stadiums with cheering crowds. Even in remote country towns, men abandoned their jobs and left their families to join what everyone believed would be a grand adventure that would be over by Christmas. The enthusiasm was infectious and almost universal. University students left their studies, clerks abandoned their desks, and farmers walked away from their crops to answer the call to arms. The spirit of mateship that had been forged in the gold fields and celebrated in bush poetry now found its ultimate expression in the willingness of men to fight and die alongside their mates in foreign lands. Within months, Australia had raised the largest volunteer army per capita of any nation in the war. The Australian Imperial Force, as it became known, represented every corner of the continent and every level of society. Lawyers served alongside shearers, bank managers marched with miners, and city boys learned to take orders from countrymen who understood discipline and hardship in ways their urban counterparts were only beginning to discover. These men were different from the professional soldiers of European armies. They were volunteers who had chosen to serve, not conscripts who had been forced into uniform. They retained the irreverent, egalitarian attitudes that characterized Australian society, showing little respect for traditional military hierarchy when it conflicted with their sense of fairness and common sense. Officers had to earn their authority through competence and courage rather than simply expecting it as their birthright. The training camps that sprang up across Australia became melting pots where men from different states, backgrounds, and occupations learned to work together as soldiers. The process wasn't always smooth. Fights broke out between men from different regions, and the discipline required for military life chafed against the independent spirit that many Australians considered their birthright. But gradually, these diverse groups of volunteers were moulded into effective fighting units that would soon earn a reputation as some of the finest soldiers in the British Empire. The first major test came at Gallipoli, a narrow peninsula in Turkey that British strategists had identified as the key to opening the Dardanelles and knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The plan seemed brilliant in its simplicity. Land troops on the peninsula, capture the high ground, and advance on Constantinople. The reality proved to be a nightmare that would haunt Australian consciousness for generations. On April 25, 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at what became known as Anzac Cove under cover of darkness. What they found waiting for them was not the lightly defended beachhead that intelligence reports had promised, but a deadly maze of cliffs, ravines, and well-prepared Turkish positions. The landing became a desperate scramble for survival as Turkish machine guns raked the beaches and artillery shells exploded among the advancing troops. The courage displayed on that first day became legendary. Men charged into withering fire to reach positions that proved impossible to hold. Officers led from the front, sharing the dangers faced by their men. Wounded soldiers crawled back into action when reinforcements failed to arrive. But courage alone couldn't overcome the fundamental flaws in the strategic plan or the determined resistance of Turkish months of trench warfare that made their homeland. What followed was 8 defenders who were fighting to protect the Western Front look like a training exercise. The Australians and New Zealanders, along with British and French forces, clung to narrow beachheads while Turkish forces held the commanding heights. Every movement drew sniper fire, every advance was met with counterattacks, and every day brought new casualties that served no apparent purpose beyond maintaining positions that had been strategically worthless from the beginning. The conditions were appalling beyond description. Summer temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius, turning the trenches into furnaces where men fought dehydration and heat stroke alongside enemy bullets. Water was scarce and often contaminated, leading to dysentery that weakened the troops as much as combat injuries. Flies swarmed over the dead bodies that lay in no man's land, creating clouds so thick they obscured vision and made eating a nauseating ordeal. Winter brought different horrors as freezing rain turned the trenches into muddy rivers and frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. Men huddled in inadequate shelters, trying to stay dry while maintaining constant vigilance against Turkish raids. Supply lines were precarious, leaving troops short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies when they needed them most. Yet somehow, the Anzacs not only survived, but developed a reputation for initiative, courage, and reliability that impressed even their enemies. Turkish commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, paid tribute to the fighting qualities of the Australian and New Zealand troops, acknowledging that they had proven themselves worthy opponents in one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. The bonds forged in the trenches of Gallipoli created something that transcended ordinary military camaraderie. These men had shared experiences that were literally indescribable to those who hadn't lived through them. They had seen their mates die in their arms, had crawled through shell-torn ground to rescue wounded comrades, and had endured months of constant danger with a stoicism that amazed observers. The mateship that had been a cultural ideal in peacetime Australia became a sacred duty that could mean the difference between life and death. Stories of heroism became part of Australian folklore, even while the campaign was still raging. Private John Simpson Kirkpatrick, who used a donkey to carry wounded men from the front lines to the beach, became a symbol of selfless courage that resonated throughout the empire. His death from sniper fire after just 3 weeks of service only enhanced his legend and provided a human face for the sacrifice being made by thousands of young Australians. The evacuation from Gallipoli in December 1915 marked the end of a campaign that had achieved none of its strategic objectives, but had created something far more valuable: a sense of Australian national identity forged in combat. The men who survived the peninsula carried with them not just physical and psychological scars, but also an unshakable confidence in their ability to endure the worst that war could offer. But Gallipoli was only the beginning. The bulk of Australian forces were redirected to the Western Front in France, where they would face even greater challenges in battles that would test every lesson learned in the Turkish trenches. The warfare on the Western Front was industrial killing on a scale that defied comprehension, with artillery bombardments that could be heard hundreds of kilometres away and casualty rates that consumed entire divisions in single battles. The Australian Corps, as it became known, quickly established itself as one of the most effective fighting forces on the Western Front. Their success came not from superior equipment or numbers, but from tactical innovations that reflected distinctly Australian approaches to problem solving. Australian commanders were more willing to experiment with new tactics, more responsive to conditions on the ground, and more concerned with minimising casualties while achieving objectives. The Battle of Pozières in 1916 became a defining moment for Australian forces in France. The village had been a German strongpoint for 2 years, resisting repeated British and French attacks. When the Australian 1st Division was given the task of capturing it, they succeeded where others had failed, but at a cost that stunned even veterans of Gallipoli. In 6 weeks of fighting, Australian casualties exceeded 23,000 men, more than the entire strength of many divisions. Yet the tactical lessons learned at Pozières would save thousands of lives in later battles. Australian commanders developed new techniques for coordinating artillery and infantry, for maintaining communications under fire, and for exploiting breakthroughs before enemy reserves. These innovations would prove crucial in the battles that lay ahead, as the war entered its final, most decisive phase. The year 1917 brought new horrors and new opportunities as the war reached a tipping point that would determine the fate of empires. Russia was collapsing into revolution, freeing up hundreds of thousands of German troops for transfer to the Western Front. But America had finally entered the war, promising to tip the balance in favor of the Allies if they could hold on long enough for American forces to arrive in meaningful numbers. For Australia, 1917 would become the year that tested the very foundations of the nation's unity and democratic values. The issue that threatened to tear the country apart wasn't military strategy or territorial objectives, but something far more fundamental: whether a democratic government had the right to force its citizens to fight and die in foreign wars. The conscription crisis began with cold mathematical logic. Australian casualties were mounting at an unsustainable rate, while voluntary enlistments were declining as the initial enthusiasm for war gave way to grim awareness of its true costs. The men who had rushed to recruiting offices in 1914 were dead, wounded, or still fighting in France. Their younger brothers and friends had seen enough casualty lists to understand that military service was more likely to end in death than glory. Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who had replaced Andrew Fisher in 1915, was convinced that conscription was essential for Australia's survival and honour. Without reinforcements, the Australian Corps would be reduced to ineffectiveness just when the war was reaching its climax. The men already serving deserved support from their countrymen, and the nation's commitments to its allies required whatever sacrifices were necessary to achieve victory. But Hughes faced a problem that would have been unthinkable in most other countries. He couldn't simply impose conscription by executive decree. Australia's democratic traditions and federal structure meant that such a fundamental change in government policy required popular approval through a referendum. The very democracy that Australia was supposedly fighting to defend would determine whether its citizens could be forced to die for that democracy. The conscription campaigns of 1916 and 1917 became the most divisive political contests in Australian history, splitting families, churches, and communities in ways that would leave scars for generations. Supporters argued that conscription was necessary to honour commitments to allies, to support men already serving, and to defend Australian values against German militarism. Opponents countered that forced military service was incompatible with democratic principles, that the war was being fought for imperial interests rather than Australian security, and that working-class families were bearing a disproportionate share of the sacrifice. The Irish Catholic community, already suspicious of British imperial policy, became a stronghold of opposition to conscription. Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne emerged as one of the most effective anti-conscription speakers, arguing that Ireland's struggle for independence made it hypocritical for Irish Australians to be forced to fight for British interests. His speeches drew enormous crowds and helped crystallise opposition among Catholic voters who had traditionally supported the Labour Party. The Labour Party itself was torn apart by the conscription issue. Hughes found himself increasingly isolated as prominent Labour figures joined the opposition campaign. The party split formally in 1916, with Hughes leading a pro-conscription faction into coalition with Conservative parties, while the anti-conscription majority maintained control of the Labour organisation. This split would reshape Australian politics for decades, creating a Conservative coalition that would dominate federal government for most of the next half-century. Women played a crucial role in both conscription campaigns, despite their recent enfranchisement making them a relatively unknown political force. Pro-conscription organizations like the Universal Service League mobilized thousands of women to support military service through patriotic rallies, fundraising drives, and emotional appeals to duty and sacrifice. Anti-conscription groups countered with their own women's organizations that emphasized the costs of war and the rights of families to keep their sons and husbands at home. The campaigns themselves became exercises in mass persuasion that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Australian democracy. Pro-conscription forces had the advantages of government resources, establishment media support, and the emotional power of appeals to patriotism and sacrifice. They organised massive rallies where returned soldiers spoke about the need for reinforcements and the debt owed to men still fighting in France. Anti-conscription campaigners relied more heavily on grassroots organisation and appeals to democratic principles and working-class solidarity. They questioned the fairness of a system where wealthy men could buy their way out of military service, while poor families bore the burden of casualties. They challenged the assumption that Australia's security required participation in European conflicts, and argued that resources devoted to overseas warfare could be better used for national development and defence. Both sides used propaganda techniques that pushed the boundaries of truth and decency. Pro-conscription materials portrayed opponents as cowards, traitors, and tools of German propaganda. Anti-conscription literature depicted conscription supporters as militarists who would destroy Australian democracy to serve British imperial interests. The campaigns created an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that made rational discussion almost impossible. The results of both conscription referendums were decisive rejections of compulsory military service, with majorities of Australian voters choosing to maintain the voluntary system despite the enormous pressures of wartime. The margins were relatively narrow, but they reflected genuine popular resistance to policies that voters considered incompatible with Australian values and democratic principles. These referendum defeats had profound consequences that extended far beyond military policy. They demonstrated that Australian democracy was robust enough to resist wartime pressures for authoritarian measures, even when those measures were supported by political and military leaders. They established precedents for popular resistance to policies imposed by distant authorities, whether in London or Canberra. Most importantly, they showed that ordinary Australians were capable of making complex judgments about national policy even under extreme circumstances. The conscription crisis also revealed the limits of Australian unity and the persistence of divisions based on class, religion, and ethnicity. The referendums created lasting resentments between communities that had previously coexisted relatively peacefully. Protestant-Catholic tensions intensified as each side accused the other of disloyalty and selfishness. Rural-urban divisions deepened as country areas generally supported conscription, while cities provided the margins for defeat. But perhaps most significantly, the conscription crisis marked the beginning of a more independent Australian approach to foreign policy and military commitments. The rejection of conscription didn't represent isolationism or lack of commitment to allies, but rather a determination that Australia would participate in international conflicts on its own terms and in accordance with its own democratic processes. Meanwhile, the war itself was moving toward its climax, as new technologies and tactics began to break the stalemate that had characterized the Western Front for 3 years. Australian forces were at the forefront of these developments, playing crucial roles in battles that would finally bring victory to the Allied cause. The Australian Corps reached the peak of its effectiveness in 1918 under the command of Lieutenant General John Monash, a Melbourne engineer who had proven himself one of the most innovative and successful commanders in the British Empire. Monash understood that modern warfare required careful coordination of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, and he developed battle plans that minimized casualties while maximizing the impact of limited resources. The Battle of Hamel in July 1918 became a showcase for these new tactics, as Australian forces captured a German strongpoint in just 93 minutes with minimal casualties. The operation demonstrated that careful planning, thorough preparation, and innovative use of technology could achieve decisive results without the massive losses that had characterized earlier battles. Monash's success at Hamel earned him promotion to full command of the Australian Corps and recognition as one of the finest generals of the war. The final months of 1918 saw Australian forces playing leading roles in the offensives that finally broke German resistance and ended the war. The Battle of Amiens in August marked the beginning of the 100 Days campaign that would drive German forces back to their own borders. Australian troops were among the first to break through German lines, capturing thousands of prisoners and demonstrating that the German army was finally losing its will to fight. But victory came at a cost that would haunt Australia for generations. Of the 416,000 Australians who served overseas during the war, more than 60,000 were killed and 156,000 wounded. These casualty rates were among the highest of any nation in the conflict, representing an enormous sacrifice from a population of less than 5 million people. Virtually every family in Australia was touched by loss, creating a shared experience of grief that would shape national consciousness for decades to come. The men who returned from the war were changed in ways that were often difficult for their families and communities to understand. They had experienced horrors that were literally indescribable to those who hadn't shared them, and many struggled to readjust to civilian life after years of constant danger and camaraderie. The concept of shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, was poorly understood at the time, leaving many veterans to suffer in silence or seek relief through alcohol and other destructive behaviors. Yet the returning soldiers also brought with them experiences and perspectives that would enrich Australian society in unexpected ways. They had travelled farther from home than most Australians could imagine, had worked alongside men from different countries and backgrounds, and had proven themselves capable of achievements that peacetime Australia had never demanded. Their confidence and worldliness challenged provincial attitudes and conservative assumptions about what Australians could accomplish. The war had also accelerated changes in Australian society that might have taken decades to achieve under peacetime conditions. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles that had previously been reserved for men. They had proven their capability in fields ranging from munitions manufacturing to agricultural labour, earning both economic independence and social recognition that would be difficult to reverse when peace returned. Industrial development had been dramatically accelerated by wartime demands for manufactured goods that could no longer be imported from Britain or other allied countries. Australian factories had learned to produce everything from steel to chemicals, creating the foundation for a more diversified and self-reliant economy. The war had demonstrated both the opportunities and the dangers of depending too heavily on international trade and foreign suppliers. The Anzac legend that emerged from the war became a cornerstone of Australian national identity, providing a narrative of courage, sacrifice, and mateship that transcended the divisions created by the conscription crisis. The story of young Australians proving themselves on distant battlefields resonated with a population that was still uncertain about its place in the world and its ability to meet the challenges of nationhood. But the Anzac legend also created myths and expectations that would complicate Australia's approach to future conflicts. The emphasis on military courage and sacrifice sometimes overshadowed other forms of national service and achievement. The focus on mateship and masculine virtues could exclude women and minorities from full participation in national life. The romantic portrayal of warfare could make it more difficult to question military commitments or consider peaceful alternatives to international disputes. As 1918 ended and the guns finally fell silent, Australia faced the enormous task of rebuilding a society that had been transformed by 4 years of total war. The challenges were immense: caring for disabled veterans, rebuilding industries that had been disrupted by military demands, and somehow healing the divisions created by the conscription crisis. But the opportunities were equally great. Australia had proven itself capable of extraordinary achievements, had developed new industries and capabilities, and had earned respect as a significant contributor to Allied victory. The young nation that had entered the war as a loyal dominion of the British Empire emerged as something quite different. A country with its own interests, its own perspectives, and its own sense of what it could accomplish in the world. The transformation wasn't complete, and many of the old assumptions about Australia's place in the imperial system remained intact. But the foundations had been laid for a more independent and confident approach to international relations that would gradually assert itself in the decades to come. The peace that followed would bring new challenges that were in some ways more difficult than the war itself. Economic reconstruction, social adjustment, and political realignment would test Australian institutions and values in ways that were less dramatic but no less significant than the battles of Gallipoli and the Western Front. The Australia that emerged from this process would be recognisably modern in ways that would have been impossible to imagine when the Commonwealth was proclaimed in 1901. But that story of transformation, with all its struggles and achievements, would unfold gradually over the next 2 decades as Australians learned to live with the consequences of their wartime experiences and the new possibilities that victory had created. The adventure was far from over, and the most challenging chapters were yet to be written. The 1920s dawned with a promise of prosperity that seemed almost too good to be true after the devastation of the Great War. Australia, like much of the Western world, was caught up in a wave of optimism that swept away the grim memories of trench warfare and casualty lists. The young men who had survived the killing fields of France and Gallipoli were coming home with stories of adventure and a confidence that had been forged in the crucible of combat. They had seen the world, proved themselves against the best soldiers of Europe, and earned respect that no amount of peacetime achievement could have provided. But the Australia they returned to was not the same country they had left behind. 4 years of war had accelerated changes that might have taken decades to unfold under normal circumstances. Women who had taken jobs in munitions factories and farms were reluctant to return to purely domestic roles. Industries that had developed to support the war effort were looking for new markets and new products. Most importantly, the old certainties about Australia's place in the world had been shaken by experiences that had revealed both the opportunities and the dangers of international involvement. The economic boom that characterized the early 1920s was built on solid foundations, but also contained the seeds of future disaster. Primary industries were thriving as European markets recovered from wartime disruption and demanded Australian wool, wheat, and minerals. Manufacturing was expanding rapidly as Australian companies took advantage of new technologies and techniques learned during the war. Urban populations were growing as people moved from rural areas to take advantage of employment opportunities in the cities. The lifestyle changes were equally dramatic. The motor car, which had been a luxury item for the wealthy before the war, was becoming accessible to middle-class families and transforming the geography of Australian cities. Suburban development accelerated as electric trams and bus services made it possible to live farther from city centres while still maintaining access to employment and entertainment. Radio broadcasting began in 1923, creating shared cultural experiences that connected Australians across vast distances for the first time since Federation. Popular culture was becoming more distinctively Australian as local artists, writers, and entertainers found audiences for work that reflected specifically Australian experiences and values. The bush ballad tradition that had emerged in the 1890s evolved into new forms of popular music that celebrated both rural and urban life. Australian rules football was consolidating its position as the national winter sport, while cricket continued to provide a link between Australia and the broader British Empire through international competitions. Women's roles were changing in ways that went far beyond their wartime employment experiences. The franchise had given them political power that was beginning to translate into social influence and legislative change. Organisations like the Country Women's Association were providing platforms for women to address issues ranging from education and healthcare to economic development and social welfare. Fashion was becoming more practical and comfortable, reflecting women's increased participation in public life and employment outside the home. And there you have it. From the first Aboriginal footsteps on ancient shores, 65,000 years ago, to the modern nation that emerged from the crucible of World War, Australia's story is nothing short of extraordinary. We've witnessed the rise and fall of the megafauna, the sophisticated firestick farming of Indigenous peoples, the desperate gamble of the First Fleet, the golden dreams that transformed a continent, and the blood-soaked trenches where a national identity was forged. This land that began as the world's most isolated continent became a crossroads of cultures, a testing ground for democracy, and proof that the most unlikely societies can not only survive, but thrive. The convicts who were meant to disappear into oblivion built cities. The gold seekers who came for quick riches stayed to build a nation. The volunteers who marched off to foreign wars returned as Australians rather than just colonists. What makes Australia's story so compelling isn't just its dramatic moments, but its demonstration that ordinary people, faced with impossible circumstances, can achieve the extraordinary. From Aboriginal elders preserving 60,000 years of wisdom, to Irish rebels finding democracy in the goldfields, from Chinese miners facing discrimination, yet building communities, to women fighting for equality while their men fought overseas. This continent has been shaped by countless individual acts of courage, determination, and hope. The Australia of the 1920s, emerging confident and modern from its baptism of fire, was still writing its story, and in many ways, it still is today.